This conference will now be recorded.
Okay, it's time to get started, and we are doing a special today in the Tough Topics series. We're going to be talking about capitalism versus socialism, and we're introducing this topic. I'm going to have a lot more to say about this capitalism versus socialism topic in future sessions. I'll have other sessions in which I discuss this, but for today's purposes, we're going to be focusing on it from the vantage point of two books by Thomas D. Lorenzo, The Problem with Socialism and How Capitalism Saved America. And these are two really good books that sort of give you a good overview of the topic of capitalism versus socialism. Now, what he doesn't do in the two books is Thomas D. Lorenzo is not looking at it from the standpoint of biblical principles and which system best aligns with biblical principles. He's looking at it purely from this vantage point of, an economic slash governmental type system and evaluating it on its merits based upon their past performance and historical fact, which is very good because that's important to our discussion. But the real question that we have as Christians is what is uh, I guess, the economic slash governmental system most consistent with biblical principles, and what are those biblical principles? So we're going to be looking at looking at this topic from that angle primarily today, although we will refer to and make references to the two books on occasion, especially as Caleb answers some of the questions that we're going to work through today. So this particular session will be in the form of an interview and a dialogue between Caleb and I, and then I'm going to open it up to Q&A at the end for about 15 minutes to see if anyone has any questions, and we'll address any questions that are maybe lingering in your mind. And if we can't get all of those questions addressed today, then we'll table them and park them for future sessions where I'm going to be dealing with this topic and probably to a greater degree and greater depth. Okay, I want to start with, and I'm going to open up with a reading from a Psalm Psalm chapter 10. And in Psalm 10, here's what the psalmist writes. He says, "Why, O Lord, do you stand far away? Why do you hide yourself in times of trouble? In arrogance, the wicked hotly pursue the poor." Now, those of a particular philosophical bent that believe that having wealth is wrong read into this passage the understanding that, oh, this arrogance must be those capitalists who have accumulated wealth and they're out here exploiting the poor. That is how a socialist, that is how a one who is anti-capitalist would interpret this passage. But that is not the context of the passage. The context of the passage is Israel, and within Israel there were those who had wealth, and those were the ones in power, positions of power in a theocracy. And it was those in a position of power using their political power to extract from the poor exorbitant amounts. Okay, so here it says, "In arrogance the wicked hotly pursue the poor. Let them be caught in the schemes that they have devised. For the wicked boasts of the desires of his soul, and the one greedy for gain curses and renounces the Lord. In the pride of his face the wicked does not seek him. All his thoughts are, there is no God." At the crux of Marxism, and part of the crux of Marxism, Karl Marx was an atheist. There is no God. His way, in other words, this is an anthropocentric view of life and of human history that's being reflected here in the writing of this psalm. His ways prosper at all times. Your judgments are on high. His ways, that is God's ways, prosper at all times. Your judgments are on high out of his sight. As for all his foes, he puffs at them. Oh, I'm sorry. So in terms of the wicked, it appears that his ways prospers at all times. And then God, from God's vantage point, your judgments are on high out of the wicked's sight. As for all his foes, he puffs at them. He arrogantly puffs at them. He, the wicked, says in his heart, I shall not be moved. Throughout all generations I shall not meet adversity. His mouth is filled with cursing and deceit and oppression, and under his tongue are mischief and iniquity. He sets an ambush in the villages. In hiding places, he murders the innocent. His eyes stealthily watch for the helpless. He lurks in ambush like a lion in its thicket. He lurks that he may seize the poor. He seizes the poor when he draws them into his net. The helpless are crushed, sink down, and fall by his might. He says in his heart, God has forgotten. He has hidden his face, he will never see it. And then the psalmist cries out, Arise, O Lord God, lift up your hand, forget not the afflicted. Now, keep that psalm in mind, and there's many, many other passages, because when we look at the results of socialism versus the results of capitalism, and I'm not talking about crony capitalism here, I'm talking about free market capitalism. When we look at the results in terms of what's happened in nations that have embraced one or the other of the two philosophies primarily, what we see is that in human history, capitalism has resulted in the greatest amount of wealth accumulation and the greatest amount of prosperity, and socialism actually ends up leveraging and using the poor in their argument to advance it to a position of prominence, and then it's the poor who suffer, just like this psalm addresses. So with that, let me open this up, and let me open it up with a word of prayer real briefly, and then I'm going to turn it over to Caleb to give some opening remarks about sort of a 2-minute summary of each book from his perspective. That's not going to do justice to these two books, but it will at least give you an idea of what the two books are about from Caleb, who's read the two books. So, Heavenly Father, I just pray that you would oversee this time together. This is a topic, the Bible, we know, addresses everything from marriage to parent-child relationships to all types of relationships in life. And it even addresses civil government. It addresses philosophies of government. It addresses the way in which we're to treat others and how we're to love our neighbors, as Jesus spoke. And if it addresses all of those things, it's amazing that the topic of socialism versus capitalism is not addressed in churches and from the pulpit, because that, in fact, relates to the very topics that the Bible addresses. So I pray that this time would be a time in which we would all be edified more thoroughly about these two topics, and we would be able to see more clearly from a biblical perspective and the biblical principles which of the two systems actually most aligns, most comports with those biblical principles. So I pray this in Christ's name. Amen. Okay, Caleb, I want to turn it over to you, and if you will, just give about a 2-minute summary of each book, okay?
Okay, sure. Well, both books made a strong argument for the significant advantages of capitalism over socialism. They both provided multiple examples for how a capitalistic system has resulted in economic prosperity and freedom for people at all income levels, and how socialism has constantly resulted in economic collapse. Both books refuted the negative myths about capitalism and the positive myths about socialism. In the book, the problem with socialism, this one focused on economic systems and governments throughout history and throughout many different countries, including the United States. It detailed the reason for the collapse of many socialist, Marxist, or communist countries, and also discussed how even small pockets of emerging capitalism has had a positive influence on these economies. And when I was reading the book, I kept trying to tie this back to biblical principles or stories. And there's a passage in Acts that some socialists attempt to use as an argument that the Bible supports socialism. If you read in Acts 2, Luke writes, "And all who believed were together and had all things in common. And they were selling their possessions and belongings and distributing the proceeds to all as any had need." And then in Acts 4, Luke writes, "There was not a needy person among them, for as many as were owners of lands or houses sold them and brought the proceeds of what was sold." But this is actually a pretty weak argument for socialism. You have to understand the context here. So this was after Jesus' death and resurrection, and at this time there was a whole lot of people that traveled to Jerusalem, and they did so to learn about Jesus' teaching from his disciples. There was a great need at that time to provide for these visitors. So various people sold their land or possessions, to help provide for all these visitors to stay for a while. But this was a singular and temporary event. And also, if all these people had not acquired this wealth through capitalistic means, they would have had nothing to sell to care for all these people. If you look in Ephesians 4, Paul writes, anyone who's been stealing must steal no longer, but must work, doing something useful with their own hands, that they may have something to share with those in need. The book, How Capitalism Saves America, mostly focused on the economic history of the United States, the intentions of our founding fathers, and how varying degrees of government intervention has either created or stifled economic growth, individual liberties, and personal freedoms. And as I was thinking about this, there's many passages in Proverbs that support this, economic gain from hard work. I'll just read a couple here. If you look in Proverbs 10, it says, a slack hand causes poverty, but the hand of the diligent makes rich. And then in Proverbs 13, it says, the soul of the sluggard craves and gets nothing. So both very good books, coming at it from a different perspective. One just focusing on the problems with socialism, and the second one focusing on how capitalism has resulted in a prosperous economic condition in the United States, but also talking about how we have over the years gotten more towards a socialist slant, and how that has negatively impacted our economy and individual liberties.
Yeah, that's great, Kayla. That's a great summary of, or just a brief in a nutshell, the two books. That's fantastic. I think also that Acts passage that you mentioned, the other thing that was worthy of note in regard to that Acts passage is that all of them were believers too, as opposed to a governmental system causing and bringing about forced redistribution. And all the redistribution that happened there was voluntary. So that's another argument against those who try to use that passage, to support there's a socialist philosophy of government and economics. So, Kayla, which of the two systems, well, I think you maybe have already addressed this somewhat for sure, but which of the two systems, in your opinion, after reading these two books and with other consideration probably, which of the two systems best align with I guess with God's character, from your vantage point?
All right, well, that's a loaded question, because you think about God's character. There's a lot of attributes of that. You think, sovereignty, eternal life, love, justice, righteousness. Omnipotence, omniscience, immutability, veracity. So it is difficult to equate some aspects of God's character to an economic system. Obviously, eternal life, omniscience, omnipotence, and immutability don't relate very well to human behaviors, but I'm sure we can pick out a few aspects of his character that does translate fairly well. If you look at a couple, righteousness and justice. So there's a lot of people that would argue that socialism is more righteous and just than capitalism. That socialism has attributes of being morally right or justifiable. What could be more righteous or just than ensuring that everyone is equal and have the same opportunities? But in practice, socialism results in even more inequality. It results in political figures becoming all powerful instead of the people that have worked hard and taken risks throughout their lives. It results in less innovation and a poor society without access to goods and services. On the other hand, capitalism is built on a meritocracy. Those that work hard, take calculated risk, work to further their education are rewarded for their efforts. A capitalistic system results in people paying for what they want or need instead of paying exorbitant taxes to maintain a welfare society or people that have not worked hard. Another aspect we could look at is love. So what could be more loving than equality of all people? Taking from the rich and giving to the poor sounds, socially responsible. But you got to think about, you talk about love, like what does that mean? And a lot of times, I think of it from like a family perspective. I mean, there aren't many parents, at least good parents, that believe the right way to love their children is to give them everything they want or fail to hold them accountable for their actions. Loving your children many times involves discipline or encourage them to work hard or be productive members of a society. But socialism encourages just the opposite. So, I think it's obvious that a capitalistic system aligns much more closely than socialism with God's character.
Yeah, I mean, that's great. I think, just to add to that a little bit, when you mentioned meritocracy and meritocracy is basically outcomes based upon merit. So that means obviously there's going to be unequal results just out of the fact that some are more talented in certain areas, some work harder and for what they get. So that's the concept behind meritocracy. But within socialism, what they're trying to achieve is equal outcomes and force everybody down the same, funnel to achieve these equal outcomes. And in fact, greater injustices ensue because the only way to bring about that type of forced compliance is through a tyrannical type governmental system. And then we'll talk more about this, I think, maybe later, but there's the financial dimension of it too. How do you pay for socialism? So that gets into some of our other questions. But back to God's character and compatibility with God's character and His righteousness. I think you definitely hit on the right attributes there: righteousness, justice, love. How do we love our neighbors? How do we love our neighbors most effectively? Well, gee, if I can go out here and use my brains and create a company that's going to employ 50 other people, then I'm in effect loving my neighbor, you know, and then if I treat them properly, I'm loving my neighbor. So I'm giving them an opportunity on their part to build their own capital and then perhaps go out and found their own company. So that doesn't happen in socialism. You couldn't do that in socialism, in pure socialism. So anyway, in terms of best compatibility with God's attributes or God's character, I think it's a clear win in the favor of capitalism. So what impacted you the most, Caleb, as you read the problem with socialism, and then also what impacted you the most as you read how capitalism saved America?
Yeah, I think the first thing I'll share is that it may have taught me a lesson about asking questions in class, but because instead of just answering my question, you gave me this like homework assignment to do, which I've been working on, for the past several weeks. But I'm just kidding, obviously. It's been a great exercise, and I really appreciate you doing that because it's really allowed me to kind of dive into this and learn some things that um, I didn't know before. But to answer your question about what impacted me the most, and I think it's pretty much the same for both books, because I think what really hit home for me was just the freedoms and individual liberties that over time the government has abrogated from citizens, and the amount of people that actually believe the lie of socialism. After all these countries have have just gone through economic destruction, people still believe that this time we can get it right.
Hmm.
It's extremely frustrating. And just the people that are fine with the government taking care of them. Our founding fathers never intended for our country to devolve into a centrally run government or economy. The power was intended to be held at the state level, where locally elected officials were held accountable, to their constituents.
Hmm.
And although the United States is still considered a capitalist country, there's been a consistent push, towards more progressive or socialist norms. One of the the other passages in the Bible that a lot of socialists use to support um, a socialist type of economy or government is in the Old Testament. When the Israelites were responsible for tithing, 1/10 of their wealth each year in order to provide for the Levites and the priests. And a lot of people use this as justification for the 16th Amendment to our Constitution or many other socialistic reforms. If you look in Numbers 18, it says, "To the Levites I have given every tithe in Israel for an inheritance in return for their service that they do, their service in the tent of meeting." But
Hmm.
we had to understand about the system is that the Old Testament tithe was a tax system for the nation of Israel, and that was only a portion of the income. There was no common ownership of property. Individuals contributed a portion of their income to provide for those who saved or served the nation as a whole. And it also wasn't a progressive tax system like we have today, which is more of a redistribution of wealth. Everyone paid the same percentage. And also, if you just think about the efficacy of any taxation system or government service, it's going to depend on those that are governing. We can't expect that a system made up of sinful human beings, is going to result in a utopia.
Right, right. Yeah. So you mentioned, you mentioned the Mosaic Law, and there's a passage in Exodus. There's probably several passages in Exodus that illustrate, how under the Mosaic Law, the Israelites were governed from a standpoint of financially needing to make financial contributions to the nation, and that was really a tax. And there was a census tax that was also part of the Mosaic Law. And we talk about progressive taxation. Well, progressive, the very word progressive, that's problematic, and that's loaded with meaning that goes all the way back to the progressive movement, that in this country's history, which was a movement really moving us away from the Constitution, viewing the Constitution as more of a living document. But the census tax in Israel, listen to what Exodus chapter 30 has to say about the census tax. The Lord said to Moses, "When you take a census of the people of Israel, then each shall give a ransom for his life to the Lord when you number them, that there be no plague among them when you number them. Each one who is numbered in the census shall give this, half a shekel according to the shekel of the sanctuary, half a shekel as an offering to the Lord. Everyone who is numbered in the census from 20 years old and upward shall give the Lord's offering." And this is the catch verse, chapter 30, verse 15. "The rich shall not give more, and the poor shall not give less than the half shekel." We're talking about flat taxation structure here. That's totally different than what we have today with our progressive income tax, which is really a way of legalizing plunder, especially when it's supporting things that are not really compatible with the Constitution and the bureaucratic administrative state, the administrative agencies that are not, compatible with the Constitution at a federal level. But at a the reason I brought that up is just simply because you had mentioned the law and the Mosaic Law and the system of tithing that was taxation. Everybody was, essentially required to give a certain percentage of their income and their wealth. And it was the same percentage for everyone, no matter whether you were wealthy or whether you were poor. So that's a good example for us to follow today. Of course, we're way far away from that. Let's move on here in the questions, Caleb. The difference between crony capitalism and socialism. I mean, often what we hear in terms of the discussions around capitalism versus socialism are discussions looking at the difference between the two from the vantage point of where we are today in this country, which you alluded to. And where we are today in this country in regard to capitalism is we're far down the road of our capitalist history as a country, and people refer to us as a capitalist economy and environment. But in reality, we're a quasi-capitalist country. We are not pure free market. We don't have a pure free market economy. It is highly regulated. It is highly interventionist in terms of the federal government's involvement, and something more. It looks very akin to something called crony capitalism. And when you start thinking about crony capitalism versus socialism, the distinctions begin to blur in the minds of especially younger people. They begin to think of our country from the standpoint of, okay, what can the government do for me? Instead of, okay, I just want to be free to go out and accumulate my wealth and then do with my wealth as I so am led by my conscience. So talk to us a minute, Caleb, about the difference between crony capitalism and socialism.
Yeah, I think you're right, Steve. And and neither crony capitalism or socialism results in a free market economy. Socialism, if you look at like the strict definition, what this really is the population collectively owns the means of production and distributes the end result proportionally. But in practice, control is normally delegated to the state. There's no private ownership of business, land, or property. The government owns all property, and then they provide that for whatever the citizens need. If you look at crony capitalism, the property is still owned privately, but lobbyists and regulations and subsidies and in general just government intervention results in practices that disrupt the free market economy. And what happens is ultimately results in less competition, higher prices for consumers, higher taxes, and an erosion of our individual liberties. There's a lot of examples throughout our nation's history, for how government intervention has resulted in dysfunction. If you look at back in the 1800s when all the railroads were built, and you contrast the Central Pacific and Union Pacific railroads with the Great Northern Railway. Well, the Great Northern Railway was constructed completely without federal subsidies, which resulted in a much less expensive project, and the profits could be passed on to consumers by lowering train fares. But when you have government paying subsidies for every mile of track built, which was the case for the Central Pacific and Union Pacific, I mean, is it any surprise that the most direct route was not built, or that the quality of construction was much poorer than a railway built by private enterprise? Both socialism and crony capitalism, result in corruption, and and this isn't any different than what happened in the first century AD. The group with the most political power in Israel in the first century was the Sadducees, and these guys, also known as the chief priests, were tightly aligned to Rome, and as a result of their chronic Roman bootlicking, the Sadducees were given responsibility for collecting taxes, leading the army, and administering the state. They also controlled the temple, and this was a lot more than some megachurch that may exist in some southern states today. I mean, the temple was the very center of Jewish society and governance. So the Sadducees held a lot of clout, both religious and political. And, so you can imagine the level of corruption which resulted from this arrangement. And that's why, John the Baptist referred to them as a brood of vipers. Jesus called them out as evil cheaters. I'm sure everyone recalls Jesus turning over the money changing tables. So, no matter what you call the system, socialism, crony capitalism, democratic socialism, Marxism, communism, government influence in economic systems results in corruption. And so, yeah, I mean, corruption also exists in private companies and organizations, but in a free market system, accountability also exists for these organizations under both the law and a competition. If you remember, several years ago when British Petroleum, Deepwater Horizon experienced the the oil spill. I mean, they immediately established a multi-billion-dollar fund to pay for what they knew was going to be ensuing litigation. But
Hmm.
when Pemex, the Mexican state-run oil company, has large spills, and they have a lot of them, right? They claim sovereign immunity, right? And the scope of the spills are never fully known in the public arena.
Yeah, which is an excellent point because that hits to the heart of one of the arguments that we hear coming from the left these days about who's the most environmentally conscious. Well, actually, if you look at the history, capitalists are the most environmentally conscious, as opposed to socialists. So there, and I think if like within the book Problem with Socialism, Di Lorenzo actually addresses that topic quite a bit. So I thought that was fascinating. And so crony capitalism, socialism, those two, it basically, when you're looking at crony capitalism, that's a great summary, by the way, Caleb. Crony capitalism is really a drift towards socialism. It's really what it is. It's a gradual, progressive view of the economy and of government's role relative to the economy, so that you have greater intervention in the economy by the government subsidizing certain businesses. I think of the car industry, the automobile industry, how that got subsidized. And there's been many other instances of subsidization of certain industries by the federal government, going all the way back throughout our history. But that subsidization, that injection of the government, is basically injecting into a sphere where there's natural, I guess, self-restraint. There was natural restraint against exploitation of others. There's natural restraint against exploitation of other people that's inherent in the capitalist model, by virtue of the fact that if I'm a true capitalist and I have a business, I am a servant to my customers. And if I have the injection of government in here where I'm getting subsidized, then for my existence, that dilutes my interest in satisfying my customers to that extent. So I'm going to be very, very interested in satisfying my customers, because why? Because somebody else can come in with a superior product or a superior services offering and outcompete me for my customer's business. So when you look at it from that perspective, capitalism actually has a very service-oriented nature to it, as opposed to the way it's typically depicted by those who are, I guess, those who are anti-capitalist in their orientation. Typically, the anti-capitalist will look at capitalists and they'll talk about all the exploitation that occurs, by those who have all the wealth and have all the money. Well, that doesn't hold up in an argument in a true free market capitalist model. It will hold up in a crony capitalist model, because that's true. That does happen. So in a crony capitalist situation, because you have the melding of politics and economics, which you gave a good example of the first century Judaism, where that exact thing occurred. It was basically the mafia. So good. That's great. Next question here is, why do you think people have a negative opinion of capitalism, and how do you respond to the charge that capitalism is built upon greed? That's a common, I guess, charge that those who are proponents of capitalism face, is that, oh well, it's built upon greed, and then they'll throw out other arguments against capitalism. How do you deal with those who have a negative opinion of capitalism and those who argue that it's built upon greed? Did the two books help us in that regard, any, Caleb?
Yeah, I think so. And I think we all have to remember that the human race consists of fallen people, and greed is going to exist in any economic system that's in place. And what I really think is happening here is, under most circumstances, people's negative perception of capitalism, may just boil down to sinful enviness, or jealousy. Some people are merely jealous of others that make considerably more money than them, and a lot of these jealous people, may be just simply lazy. And what I think happens is, politicians capitalize on this envy by promising free stuff. If you look at the taxation system in our country, you know, the bottom 50% of U.S. citizens pay only about 2.5% of the federal income tax burden. And Democratic socialists know that if they could get the bottom 51% paying no income tax, and we're not too far away from this, that they can pretty much lock up the election, you know, supporting their greed for power.
Hmm.
You know, I think a lot of people fail to realize that most of these well-paid individuals achieve their high salaries through hard work and risking their own capital. You know, not by relying on a living wage or welfare from the government.
Hmm.
They also fail to realize that the innovations created by these people who were motivated by capitalism have resulted in substantially lower costs for goods and services, and it's also improved the quality of life for ordinary people. You know, today, even the lower middle class citizens of our country have a much more comfortable lifestyle than the aristocracy enjoyed 100 years ago. And, you
Hmm.
know, this level of innovation can only be achieved through a competitive free market. You know, even Abraham, you know, the father of our Jewish nation, was a rich man. If you look in Genesis
Hmm.
13, you know, Moses writes, you know, now Abram was very rich in livestock and silver and in gold. If you read First Thessalonians, the second chapter, Paul writes, surely you remember, brothers and sisters, our toil and hardship. We work night and day in order not to be a burden to anyone. That's the key phrase there, not to be a
Hmm.
burden to anyone while we preach the gospel of God to you. And and lastly, on this point is that greed is not limited to money. Greed for power also exists, and this is much more dangerous than a greed for money. This greed
Hmm.
for power is exactly what democratic socialists want. They want the power to regulate businesses for their own desires, to tell individual citizens how much they have to pay in taxes and what programs these tax dollars will be used for. I'm okay with guys like Tim Cook or Steve Jobs, being billionaires, because my life is a whole lot more productive because of them, man. And
Hmm.
if I'm ever dissatisfied with my iPhone, I'll buy something else. But
Hmm.
what I'm not okay with is paying exorbitant taxes to the federal government to fund programs that I don't use or support.
Hmm. Yeah. Oh, yes. And you mentioned Steve Jobs and Tim Cook and others who have made billions. But also, the other benefit of that is, yeah, okay, they made their billions, and that's great. But they also just think about how many people they made millionaires, and how many people they even they've created a whole industry. Imagine our economy today without without all of these products that Apple makes or that other technology providers make. What would that look like? I mean, that would take us back to like I don't know, the 70s, I guess, where we didn't have those kinds of devices. I mean, there's the number of people who are employed in technology related jobs today is phenomenal. So they created a whole boom of employment through their innovation and through their creativity. That doesn't arise in a socialist model. That kind of there's no incentive for people to be creative in a socialist model. It destroys creativity, as a matter of fact. So the more prosperous societies are those that are capitalist, because there's greater freedom. There's the right to own property, the right to accumulate capital. It's all there. So great answer and great response to that. You mentioned, I think it was interesting, Caleb. You mentioned democratic socialism, and I thought it was interesting. And I think it's in both of the books that Di Lorenzo talks about that a bit, and he talks about Scandinavia, how that's often held up, by those who are of a socialist, orientation. They hold up Scandinavia as an example, or they may hold up Europe, some of the European countries, as an example of the success of democratic socialism. But what they fail to mention is that Scandinavia realized after their experiment in socialism that this isn't working. So they started pulling away from that and moving back toward a more capitalistic structure in terms of their economy. Also, the other thing that's not mentioned in regard to the European model of socialism, because that's generally considered that's generally held up as the example of democratic socialism versus the totalitarian type socialism we see in Venezuela and that we've seen in other countries, Cuba and other places that eventually morphs into communism. Um, what we see in those in Europe, for instance, is the reason why those countries have been able to make it for this long under more of a socialistic type structure is that because the protection of those countries has been we have protected them. The United States has provided them a subsidization for their very existence by providing them the defense of their countries and a defense of Europe effectively. Um, and just imagine what would have happened if the United States had not been, part of NATO and would have pulled out of, or not even ever been part of NATO for the common defense of Europe. They would not even Europe would be subsumed today by Russia or by some other communist country that's further along in the socialist to communist trajectory. They would have been subsumed by them. They would not still be in existence. So, and then you look into the financial model where you've got the IMF involved in the subsidization of these countries and their currencies. All of that plays a role in the fact that the so-called models of democratic socialism that exist that are often held up in this argument and in this debate have really been subsidized in terms of their continued existence. So I just wanted to point that out. In regard to that particular discussion. It was really good. Um, which I think we've already hit on this next question quite a bit, Caleb. Which of the two systems best supports individual liberty and responsibility? But you may have some other things to say about that based upon your read of the two books.
Yeah, I think, it's obviously capitalism. I think it's clear. That's the short answer.
Yeah.
But, I mean, if I choose to donate money to Planned Parenthood, that may not be in line with biblical principles, but that's my choice. However, my tax dollars should not support this organization or thousands of other special interest or welfare programs. As was pointed out in how capitalism saved America, individual contributions to the poor and charitable contributions have declined significantly, over the past, several decades because people feel that their tax dollars are already going to support these organizations, whether they agree with their cause or not. So why should they, support these charities when the government's going to take care of them? If you look in 2 Corinthians 9, Paul writes, that each one must give as he has decided in his heart, not reluctantly or under compulsion, for God loves a cheerful giver. Well, there aren't too many people that are cheerful givers to the U.S. government, and the Democratic Socialists they want free college, free health care, but nothing is free. And what if I don't want to go to college, or what if I'm a healthy individual? Why should I have to pay for those that desire to go to advanced education, or someone that is not healthy due to their own lifestyle choices? We've already created a welfare state in which there's little incentive to work, but the Democratic Socialists want to completely eliminate any motivation to work by creating a living wage. By paying more taxpayer money to single mothers, we continue this cycle of destruction. Girls of single mothers are much more likely to have children out of wedlock. Boys of single parents are much more likely to be involved in violent crime. So anyway, that's a long way of answering your question, but I think it's obvious that capitalism definitely supports individual liberties much more than socialism.
Yeah, and responsibility that goes along with it too, right? Yeah, I think the whole idea behind democratic socialism and some of the promises that are made to lure people into it is what's really going on here is they're in quote unquote democratic socialism, which after you vote it in, how do you get rid of it? Yeah, but the whole idea there is you're really buying votes is really what's happening, and it's all about power, like you said. It's all about acquiring power. and the hypocrisy that begins to emerge, as we've seen recently, in the news regarding the Speaker of the House, just one example of many, many, many examples of the inherent hypocrisy between those who are promoting socialism and want the power and the way they behave and the way they conduct their lives versus that academic mass that's out there from their perspective. They don't care about the individual. They're really all about getting the power. You're just you're not even a name to them. You're just a number, to them. So there's no it's really all about gaining power and then also exploiting that power once you've got it at the expense of the proletariat that you use to ride your way into power. Okay, so we talked about this next question quite a bit too, and I think is socialism financially viable? I think you've covered that pretty well, but let me just see if you have any other comments on, is socialism financially viable?
Yeah, I'll just say a few things that were referenced from the two books. So, you know, socialism does it sounds great in principle, but it doesn't work in practice. And I think it gets back to the original sin and fallen man. And when you put a system in place that has little accountability to constituents, corruption is going to naturally ensue. If you're a colony of ants, it works wonderful, but not for fallen people uh, unless there's a system of accountability. Nothing is free. Someone has to pay for it. And like you said, I truly believe that the true mission of the Democratic Socialists is power, but they advertise their campaign by ensuring the dignity and equality of all people. But what they do this by redistributing wealth and just giving money away by giving people an opportunity to work and improve their lives through hard work. And if
Mm-hmm.
you think about it, are we really providing dignity for people by handing out money to them from the state? I mean,
Hmm.
what kind of dignity is that supporting? Like one of the most famous verses supporting this is what Paul writes in Second Thessalonians 3. He says, if anyone is not willing to work, let him not eat. Um, you know, if you just look at what's happening in Venezuela, you think about this. They had the largest oil deposits in the entire world, larger than Saudi Arabia or the UAE. They were once the richest country in Latin America. And now they've just gone through economic collapse. They've got the highest inflation rate in the world. And this was all due to nationalizing their oil production, the corruption, the regulation, the high taxes, the redistributing wealth, all resulting from their embrace of socialism. If
Mm-hmm.
you look back in the Psalms, David writes, do you rulers indeed speak justly? Do you judge people with equity? No, in your hearts you devise injustice, in your hands mete out violence on the earth. And that sounds a lot like what's happening in Venezuela, Cuba, the USSR, former USSR, and many other socialist countries. There's, um, you know, over 40 countries that have attempted it and failed, but there's a lot of people that still think that this time we're going to get it right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so true. It's funny. I've talked with at least two people from Venezuela and about this very topic and what happened in Venezuela. And I did not realize it until talking to one of them, and they told me that all of that happened within 10 years. They had a constitution that was very similar to the United States Constitution, but how it all came about and how it started was gradually. What happened was they concentrated. They basically they took the power away from the legislature by consolidating power at the executive, and then you basically ended up with a dictatorship. And then once they got the dictatorship into place with all that power concentrated at that level, then the fiats from the top began to occur, and the economy fell. And the whole beautiful structure that they had in place with people being prosperous completely collapsed within a decade. It all happened within a decade. So if we think that we're immune from that possibly happening in this country, we're fooling ourselves. It's happening. And we're definitely on that path. In fact, if this next election goes the wrong way, we will have made the first step. Well, actually, we've already started making steps in that direction, but we will have made the first major leap in the direction of the consolidation of power at the executive level, so that the legislature doesn't mean anything. And that's what the left has tried to do, quite frankly, over the past a number of years anyway, is negate the power of the legislature and consolidate it into the executive level. So if the election goes the wrong way this fall, that's exactly what will happen. Okay, let's see. I think we've touched upon, and already talked a lot about, doesn't the success of European countries validate the democratic socialist model? Let me just move to the next question after that, Caleb, because I want to allow some time for Q&A and make sure that we do allow some time. And I've got other questions we can talk about in case no one has any questions. But what type of system most resembles that which will probably be used by the evil, prophetic Babylon and the beast during the last days? Is it capitalism, free market capitalism, or is it something more akin to a tyrannical form of socialism?
Yeah. So I think that just as many leaders, and when I say leaders, I'm talking about people that are in positional power. They may not be true leaders, but anyway, but these leaders have used the lie of socialism to promote its advantages. The beast will use a lie to resonate with a lot of people around the world. During the last days, the Antichrist is going to centralize power, and and this sounds very socialistic by capitalistic to me. And obviously, this system is completely at odds with the intentions of our founding fathers from our country, or biblical principles, as we've talked about for nearly the past hour now. If you look back through biblical history at the Tower of Babel, God created the concept of nations. God also established Israel as the model nation, for the entire world. Throughout the Bible, we see several examples of capitalistic concepts promoting individual liberty and responsibility. But all around the world today, we are seeing the developments of a borderless environment and growing calls for socialism and worldwide equality. And given that socialism has continually failed time and time again, and there are still so many people that have been fooled into believing that it's going to work this time, I can also easily see how so many people will be, fooled into believing the lie during the last day. So anyway, that's a long way of saying that. I think it's pretty clear that that a socialistic economy or a Marxist type government is what that's going to exist during the last days, and we could be observing the stage being set for this type of system.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So real briefly before we move to Q&A, because I want to open it up to Q&A here in just a couple of minutes, Caleb, would you recommend these two books for folks to read?
Yeah, they're actually wonderful books, and they were both came at it from a kind of a different slant, but they had the same message. They're very easy to read. It took me just a couple of days to get through either one of them. So they're very sound arguments throughout the entire book, with a whole lot of examples of exactly like what the dynamics were that occurred to create economic prosperity and capitalistic type of systems, and exactly what dynamics led to the economic collapse in socialistic type of systems.
Great. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I thought they were. I think they're both wonderful books. They're just good reference. They've got a lot of examples in there, like you mentioned, and I think those are, having the examples are sort of like here's the evidence. Here's the theory. That we can talk about the theory and we can talk about biblical principles all day long, which is great. We need that, but we need to balance it with, okay, here's all the examples and the more factual evidence to support the argument. And the two books do provide a lot of examples in that regard. So let's do this. Let's open it up to questions to the audience, and let's just see if you have any questions. Let me see. I'm gonna stop sharing. Well, actually, I'm gonna go over here and flip over to this other view so I can see everybody. And let's see if anybody has any questions. I think you probably are seeing my screen now with the little panels that shows everybody that's participating. Anybody have questions that they want to ask Caleb or myself about this topic? Okay, just feel free to unmute and jump in. Yes, Kathy.
Caleb, what was the order of the books? Did he write them far apart, or which one did he write first? Which one was second? Of course, there's only two, but thank you.
Yeah, I'm gonna let Steve answer that because one of them I listened as an audiobook and the other one I read as a paper copy. So I'm not exactly sure.
Yeah. So
you can answer that question.
Yeah, I can. I've got them right here. The problem with socialism is copyrighted 2016, and I think, if I'm not mistaken, the How Capitalism Saved America is a little bit older than that. I think I was going to say around 2010, but let me just check the copyright here. 2004. So yeah, 2004 versus 2016. So there's quite a big gap there between the two, but there is a little bit of overlap between the two. I mean, he calls out a couple of the same examples here and there in both of the books as he's developing his argument and supporting his argument. But they're wonderful reads regardless. He's a great writer. He's written a lot of other books, by the way, that you might find interesting and profitable as well. But these two are the focus of our discussion today anyway. Yeah, so good question. Any other questions?
Hey Steve, it's Brett.
Yeah.
Hey Caleb, you did a great job. My question is, back when Steve asked you about why did they think, or why did the author think that they thought capitalism was evil and why they preferred socialism? And I remember your answer, but I also wondered if the author had mentioned if maybe their background was like in university, they're just not taught. They're not taught our history. They're not, well, or true history. And it's just a matter of them not being taught, because I can remember back when I was in, at Arizona State, even in the 80s, a lot of the classes I was taking, if you didn't know the history, you weren't being taught that. So I was just curious if he even mentioned that, Caleb.
Yeah, and Brett, that's a really good point that you bring up, and I forget which one of the books that he did mention that in, but it is definitely mentioned, and it's mentioned from a couple of perspectives. And one is like just the fact that that is what is taught in a lot of universities, that that capitalism promotes greed. And the second thing that is pointed out was that a lot of our taxpayer dollars are going to fund those universities.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, I'll add to that too, Brett. And I'm actually in the future, when I talk about capitalism, socialism, Marxism, educational system, what's happened in our educational system over the past several decades. I'm going to be talking to some of those topics in the future. One of the individuals that I'm going to mention that's played a very significant role in injecting distortion and into the educational pipeline, especially over the past probably 4 or 5 decades, is a man by the name of Howard Zinn. And I'm reading a book right now called Debunking Howard Zinn by Mary Grabar, and it is absolutely fascinating. He played as, I guess, as insidious of a role as anything in injecting into our country's educational pipeline a false narrative regarding our history and regarding and really promoting essentially the Marxist, the Marxist ideology of creating conflict, a conflict that can only be resolved through kind of a move away from a capitalist model to a socialist model. And so I'm seeing that in the book that I'm reading right now, and I'm seeing that emerge. So I'll bring some of that into the conversation in the future. But the educational pipeline in our country over the past 4 or 5 decades or so has been heavily influenced by Marxist ideology injected into the educational learning approaches and teaching approaches, and even what was taught. Howard Zinn wrote a book called A History of the United States, and that History of the United States became the go-to manual by most who were teaching in the, I guess you might say, the liberal arts arena, of most universities. And even today, when you hear somebody talk about, what's happened in the history of the United States, many times they will be referencing or they will be quoting from someone who's been heavily influenced by Howard Zinn and his history of the United States. And so that is a huge issue. And so I might be talking about that in the future more as I learn more in reading this book, and I'll have to do some other research outside of the book to bring all of that to the table. But great question. Anybody else?
I had one more. I'm sorry.
That's okay.
Hey, so Caleb, on at the very beginning, when Steve wanted you to kind of summarize everything, I think I remembered you had mentioned that the author had, I don't know if he quoted or just commented that some of the people that believed in socialism or spouted it was quoting the Bible. Of course, they were taking it out of context. That they said even some of the Bible had supported socialism, and I was wondering if he had quoted any particulars. Like, was it just a public opinion, or where did was he quoting was he introducing other people's worldview? I was just kind of curious as to kind of the backstory on that, or if that was just an overall comment that he made that he heard people saying.
Yeah. So just to be clear, nothing in either one of the books, was came from a biblical perspective. Like Steve and I kind of talked through the how we're going to present this, and and what we wanted to do was relate it, problems with socialism or the endorsement for capitalism, back to biblical principles. So everything that I referenced in the Bible were just our attempt to relate those concepts back to biblical principles, but none of that was mentioned in either one of the books.
Okay, my bad. I guess I misunderstood, and then I was curious as to what worldview that he was mentioning. So yeah, okay, that now I understand. Thanks, Caleb.
Yeah, that's a really good point, because what we did talk about was the fact that we didn't want to make this be, a synopsis of the two books entirely. I mean, we definitely wanted to leverage what was there in the two books and bring that into the discussion. There's just no way to do justice to these two books in an hour time frame. But this is a this is a church, and we do want to relate everything that we're doing to the Bible. That is our standard. So the approach that we took was to say, okay, what are the biblical principles with which the principles that are sort of enunciated in these two books align, and that's the focus that we wanted to take in terms of this sort of Q&A interview about the two books, and that's the approach that we'll be taking going forward. Anytime we discuss something like this, that's a current contemporary issue, it's all about, we've got to have our standard of measure is the Bible. And if we try to approach, evaluating these issues from just the standpoint of what we think is right or wrong, then ours is just another opinion sitting out there. And one of the things I've learned, and I'll say this in one of these classes that I'm taking right now, it's on educational theories, is there are a number of educational theories out there, and that address things such as how people think, how students think, how people learn, and so these theories are really fascinating. And there's one family of theories that's called constructionism, and or not constructionism. Let me see. It's let me see. Cognitive. Yeah, constructivism. Constructivism, not constructionism. Constructivism. And so there's one family of theories called constructivist theories. Is basically there's sort of a range within this family of theories, and the range goes from sort of the extreme form of constructivist theories that basically says the individual constructs all the knowledge they possess. They construct it. Well, that's where educational theory and that's where educational practice has gravitated, is the individual constructs the truth that they possess. And that's where we hear the terms and phrases, your truth, my truth. We hear that all the time. It's coming right out of our educational pipeline and the educational theory that's been employed now for several decades. And it's called constructivist theories and the constructivist family of theories. I'll have more to say about that in the future, but this whole point about the educational pipeline and what role it's played, it is humongous in terms of where we are today. And it plays right into this discussion about capitalism versus socialism. Most of those who are in the educational pipeline, because they're academicians, and they've been influenced by the academy and the theories that the academy has embraced, those theories are compatible with the Marxist influence of such men as Howard Zinn. So that's why we are where we are today, where people are thinking, oh, socialism sounds pretty good. And they're not even critically thinking about this from a financial viability perspective, nor from a freedom perspective. They don't even know about the Constitution. I mean, so that's almost unknown. So any other questions?
Hey, Steve, wasn't it Margaret Thatcher that said, yeah, socialism is great until you run out of other people's money? Wasn't it she that said
Yeah,
that?
yeah, she said that. She was pretty good. Yeah, it's really good until you run out of other people's money. Anybody else? Questions? And then we'll close out if there's no questions. Questions? I'll give it a once, twice, thrice times. Okay. Caleb, great job. Excellent, excellent job. And really, really good job of responding to all those questions. I thought that was really good. So we'll try to do more of this in the future. I think this model, we'll see if anybody else wants to take it on. This model, I think we set the standard here for what I expect out of these types of opportunities. Caleb did a great job of answering these questions and really responding to them extremely well. So really appreciate that and appreciate his effort. I know there was no small effort pulling together, doing the reading of the books and then thinking through the questions and thinking of ways to respond to them. That's not a trivial effort. So really appreciate that. Finally, one opportunity for questions, and then we'll close it out. Okay. Okay, well, Heavenly Father, thank you so much for this time. I pray that it's achieved its objective, and we've at least put our toe in the water of this area of biblical truth as it applies to our current contemporary circumstances. And I just pray that this has been beneficial to everyone, and we'll leave this in your hands and pray all of this in Christ's name. Amen. Well, thanks, everybody. See you Wednesday, okay? Bye-bye.